All right, I think we're going to go get started. I have my webcam on so you can see who I am. I'm Lisa Andreasen from Keystone. I'm a school psychologist, been with the agency for 8 years, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about data tonight. So if you get bored, I apologize. It's not the most fun topic, but if you can't hear me, just let me know. I did a check a little bit ago, and it sounds like everybody was able to hear that was out there so far. I'm just going to read the statements that I have to read at the beginning of the webinar. Just make sure that all paraeducators at your site are taking this research class for credit, that you've typed your name in the chat box. Once all of your names have been typed in, make sure you click the chat button on the bottom so that it'll email us or connect in that you're here. You do not need to sign in if you're only attending just for professional growth with no credit. But credit will only be given if you signed in, so please make sure you signed in. So just don't forget, sign your name in. All right. Are we doing okay on sound? I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint here in a second. All right, make sure we're in here. All right, so I should be sharing my screen with you. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. I don't know if all of you guys had a chance to look at this. It's been out there. If not, you can print it off whenever you would like to. Get this in full screen. All right, are you guys able to see my PowerPoint presentation? All right. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about data and the collection of data. I know this isn't probably everybody's favorite topic. It's maybe a little boring, but I'm trying to make it as entertaining as possible. So just bear with me. If you have questions, make sure you're using the chat box and just let me know if you have questions. And I'll try to do my best to respond to those. I'm watching the questions on my iPad as I'm talking, so if I don't get to you, just say your question a couple times, and I'll like I said, I'll do my best to get at those. Like I said, I'm worked at Keystone for 8 years, and I am a school psychologist, so data kind of falls in my background of things that I've been highly trained in and things that I do a lot of data collection. So it's kind of maybe why I'm the one talking about that tonight. The purpose of the presentation tonight is, is it going to switch my pages? Okay. Sorry, we have a little bit of a delay here. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So the purpose of the presentation tonight is just going to kind of talk about a few things. First of all, why do we need so much data? I know a lot of you have worked in schools for a really long time, so data collection is kind of something you hear all the time. That's language that's out there a lot. So we'll kind of talk about why the purpose of that is. What kind of data is there that we collect? A lot of you are probably paraprofessionals in special ed classrooms or work with students with special needs. And there's even more data collection that we do with students with special needs. I'm going to kind of touch on what your roles as paraeducators are in that data collection, what's okay for you to do, what's not okay, kind of some of those things that you should stay away from, or things that if a teacher asks you to do it, that's really okay to do those things. And then I'm going to give some examples of how to collect both behavior data and academic data. So those are kind of the topics we'll hit tonight. So why do we need so much data? As we all know, No Child Left Behind kind of started pushing us forward with that collection of data, and we've really been pushing for collecting data for annual yearly progress. We're really looking at, are students making that progress? Are they mastering skills that we're expecting, like on the Iowa Core? If our students are making progress in reading curriculum, math curriculum, different things like that. But those annual yearly progress types of things are really those like Iowa assessments, the NWA MAP testing, MAP testing, not math testing. Some schools use DIBELS as a progress monitoring tool. There's a lot of different things that we can use for that annual yearly progress, but that's the stuff that we report to the state as a school district, that collective data that determines if we're making progress as a school, as a grade level, and by different subgroups of populations of schools. But the other reasons we need so much data is for IEP compliance. For students that have special needs, we do collect a lot of data about how they're progressing towards their IEP goals. We do have regulations with our IEP compliance that IEPs are monitored at least every 2 weeks. So teachers, special ed teachers, are really being pushed to collect that data at least every 2 weeks, if not weekly. And this is where those of you who work with students with special needs really can become quite helpful in that process. Is there are some things that you can do to help collect that data if that's something that the special ed teacher that you support maybe needs some help or assistance in getting some of that done. There are some things you can help with that. I know in the past that there may have been times when you're like, oh, is that okay? Am I allowed to collect that data? Am I allowed to do this or that? And I'll talk about that a little bit and give you some examples of ways that I've seen paraprofessionals be used and inappropriate use of you guys in doing that kind of collection. And then really the most important reason why we collect data is for making educational decisions. We don't just collect data for the sake of collecting data. Sometimes it feels like that, like all we're doing is just collecting all this data and nobody's doing anything with it. Or why do we have to take so many tests at school? Why are we constantly in the computer lab taking STAR tests and taking MAP tests, and then we take the Iowa test? And sometimes we feel like that's all we're doing, but hopefully your teachers and administrators are using that information and that data to make decisions about what do we need to focus on for our teaching, what are some emphasis that we need for professional development, what are things that students need a focus in, and that hopefully that's what we're doing. With students with special needs who have IEPs, we use that data to help determine if instructional changes are needed. So your teachers will be looking at that data on a regular basis to say, gosh, that specially designed instruction that I'm doing is just not working. What do I need to change? Or Johnny's not becoming a better reader. What do I need to change to make that better? So that's really the purpose of all that data. Again, it feels like a lot. And we collect data not just for academic purposes, but we collect it for behavioral purposes too. And sometimes that's data that we collect more frequently too. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about the differences of those. But ultimately, we really need to know where kids are performing at so that we can teach them appropriately and make those best decisions. So there's a lot of different kinds of data that we can collect. Some of these things would be data sources that you guys could be helpful in collecting as paraeducators. Some of these are assessments that if you were asked to give one, I would have you strongly say, ooh, I think that might not be okay. So one of the first things, especially if you're working with students with special needs, general outcome measures tend to be those things that we look at with kids with IEPs, students that have special needs. We use a lot of general outcome measures for those students, which would be looking at things like fluency, so those 1-minute timed readings that you see kids taking. Or if you have kids doing maze passages for fluency, or if you see, there's a variety of different things that you may see out there that are general outcome measures. Some of those are classroom-made things that might give you an indication if a student is doing well overall in math or overall in reading. FLTAD data, the frequency, latency, intensity, topography, accuracy, and duration. That kind of data is often stuff that we collect when we're talking about behaviors. It's very important when we look at kids with behavior needs, or if we're like going to assess behavior, that we look at how often is that happening. And I'm going to give you guys an example later on of a frequency chart that we may ask you to use, especially if we're conducting a functional behavior assessment. I know that you guys had a session a couple months ago that they talked about functional behavior. If you have students that have needs and teachers are conducting functional behavior assessments, a lot of times you as paraeducators are the ones that tend to get asked to help collect that data, because you may be following that student from class to class, or you may be with that student more regularly, especially if you're at that middle school or high school level where they're switching classes pretty regularly. Again, you might be that person being asked to collect some of that frequency data. And I did a little case study for you guys, so you can practice doing one here in a little bit. Latency would refer to how much time occurs between when I give that direction and before they respond. Or if I say, you know, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I need you to go sit at the carpet. And if Jimmy takes 14 seconds to go sit at the carpet, that's the latency time. Intensity, obviously, is how severe that behavior is. And I'll give you some examples of these in a little bit of ways that we measure some of that. But intensity would look at, like, did Johnny tell me to shut up, or did Johnny swear at me? There's a level of difference of intensity of those behaviors. Topography really looks at what does that behavior look like. So does behavior look like I'm red in the face and I'm yelling and screaming, or does behavior look like I'm sad and withdrawn? Or does it look like verbal aggression? Does it look like physical aggression? So that's that topography. Accuracy, we often are measuring accuracy with academic things, but we can also measure accuracy of behavior with how accurate students are at displaying the behaviors that are correct. So if we say that they should be respectful to others, how accurate are they in being respectful to others throughout a day? And then duration is when we measure how long a behavior occurs. So those are some of those kinds of data that we collect, and often these are the biggest, those top two are the ones that we collect a lot for our students with special needs. Progress towards Iowa core standards. Some of you may work in classrooms with teachers who use rubrics to measure things, or those checklists of skills to see if students are mastering different skills on Iowa core standards. Sometimes these don't give us numbers, like percentages, like they got 70% correct, but sometimes it's a checklist of by the end of first quarter they need to be able to write all of their letters. They need to be able to count to 40. They need to be able to do these different skills. And so you'll see that sometimes for students, rubrics and things like that. Formative assessments tend to be those things that teachers just give during class. Those are going to be typically things that maybe you as paraeducators may be asked to read to a student if a student needs something read aloud. They're probably not going to be things that you will know about in advance always. So a formative assessment might be something that it might be a pop quiz kind of a thing that's a pop quiz to not only the students, but to you as the paraeducator. So that might be something that comes up where you're going, oh no, all right, got to take these kids in the hallway or find a place to do that. Or it may be a simple thumbs up, thumbs down from a teacher about whether or not students get the information. Pre and post test, those are also ways that you guys might be asked to be involved, is any tests that are given in the class, to read those, help students take them in a different location, things like that. One area where I hope would not be asked to try and support But like diagnostic assessments are typically things that, like, myself as a school psychologist, I give a lot of diagnostic assessments. And those are things that really take some pretty specific training and understanding of how to administer a diagnostic assessment. So those would be things that I would hope your teachers aren't asking you to give, or to administer something that's more diagnostic, because that does require a different level of, I don't want to say education necessarily, but it does require that it's a little more specific to what that teacher would be looking at and doing with it. So I'd be hesitant if someone asks you to administer something like a Woodcock-Johnson, or an assessment that that's kind of a more standardized formal diagnostic assessment. The last thing here that I put on here was district-wide assessment data, and those are things that I think are appropriate. They are standardized assessments, but I also look at them as being assessments that are appropriate for paraeducators to be supportive of, to read out loud, to help with administering of those. And those are those things. We give them maybe once a year. Sometimes the MAP test we give 2 or 3 times a year. And those would be things that it's highly appropriate for you as paraeducators to be supportive of through the reading of tests, sitting by a student to help maintain attention to the task and things like that. And then also a district-wide assessment that schools use is the DIBELS assessments. And I do think under proper training that you as paraeducators can be highly skilled in administering those assessments as well. Some of the things I would encourage, though, is if you are being asked to help with those district-wide assessments, that you've had a chance to be given all of the same information that the general ed teachers have been given to administer those, like the directions. It's not fair for you guys to be put into a position where you're being told, here, go read this test, when maybe you haven't been provided with all the directions. If there's changes to things that, we've moved now from the Iowa Test of Basic Skills and Test of Educational Development to the Iowa test. And I think that there's a difference in how we administer those assessments. And so being fully aware of what's going on and what the expectations are is really important. So what is your role as paraeducators? I think sometimes the line can get a little blurred with what your role is when you, in data collection. I think that probably some of you have been asked to do more than others in this area, and maybe some of you have hardly ever been asked to help with administering assessments or collecting data. But I think it's important that you kind of have a sense of when it's appropriate, when it's not, what are the different things that you should be doing. One of the best ways that we utilize paraeducators, and I'm sure that all of you have done this, is reading assessments to students. Some schools have moved to one-to-one computer initiatives for students, and so some of you maybe have stepped back in that role as technology is maybe reading assessments to students. But there's always that time when that assessment's not going to be on the computer or not be able to be read by technology, that you are going to have to step in and read that. Reading tests can be tricky. I trained as a school psychologist, and we took classes on how to administer assessments, how to speak at a proper tone, how to speak at a proper rate, how to give that test in the most appropriate manner so that it's non-biased. And that can be really hard, especially when you're reading through a test and you see that your students that you're reading to are struggling. It's really hard not to say, and answer C, and really emphasize your answer C, because that's correct. So I think that that's something that takes practice. And I often encourage teachers to give their paraeducators that assessment at least a day in advance, so they have time to read through that, so that you guys have time to prepare and look at it and be, okay, I know what the answers are to this, but I'm going to try to read this without inflecting my voice, without giving answers away, without giving helps. Now, I know that's not always possible, that test gets to you in advance. I'm well aware of that. Sometimes those come to you 10 minutes before the class, or in the middle of class you find out about it. But just reading assessments can be one of those most valuable things that you guys can do to help with that data collection. Administering non-standardized and non-diagnostic assessments, I think that that's a really great way that you guys can have a little more hands-on activities as well with the students that you work with. I know sometimes we're hesitant with some of those reading probes or some of those things, not knowing if that's okay. But I think when you guys have the right instruction on how to do that, I think administering fluency passages are highly appropriate. A lot of our fluency probes that we do for students with special needs are just timed activities where, you present them with a math probe and you say, okay, you have 2 minutes and I want you to begin. And there's really not a lot of instruction that you need to do. You don't have to do error analysis. It's really you're timing a test, more or less. Helping administer online assessments, like some of our school districts use the Easy CBM probes for math, for reading comprehension, and some of those, that's a great way for you to help with that, is to just sit by a student and help them navigate through those questions, help them stay on task, things like that. Administering lots of different kinds of, like, writing fluency probes would be a great, use of your time and efforts to help support that data collection. And, grading is something you shouldn't be doing, but you could help score these assessments if you have those answer keys and things like that. One thing, if you're being asked to give assessments like the basic reading inventory or the qualitative reading inventory, or some of those other reading assessments that ask you to do error analysis of what a student is doing, that's someplace where I would tell you to be a little more hesitant unless you have some real training in that, because really that error analysis piece, especially if you're not helping provide any of that instruction, should really be done by the instructor, because they're going to use that information to make those educational decisions. But I'm going to show you later on kind of how to do those DIBELS fluency passages. Some of you have probably helped with that for a long time. Some of you may have never seen those. So I'm going to walk you guys through how to kind of collect information on reading fluency as one way. One of the other ways that you can be helpful in collecting data is collecting student behavior data, and we talked about that a little bit with frequency charts, time duration of behaviors, monitoring removals from class, taking qualitative notes, to get at what does the behavior look like, to kind of help define what are some things we can do. And like I said earlier, you guys are in the classrooms more than our special education teachers are usually, and you're also able to be more aware of that one student than the classroom teacher who's looking at the behaviors and the needs of all the students in the class. You can be real focused and targeted, so that's a way that I think is really helpful. Recording and charting student data. I know at some school districts they've had maybe a paraeducator or someone assigned to maybe do data entry. I know some paras that have been assigned to do like the HEART data entry for maybe their office referrals and things. They're not writing the office referrals necessarily, but they're entering that data into like the HEART database. I know some paras that are actively involved in helping chart student data on web IEPs. If you have that right from your teacher to go in and enter that data. That's a great way to help. I certainly hope your teachers are looking at that as well, because they need to be monitoring the progress as well. But if you have school databases and stuff, that's a real excellent use of your skills as paraeducators as well. Checking student work, if there's an answer key and things like that, that's not inappropriate as long as they're not asking you to do analysis. So sometimes if you're asked to be like writing examples, that can be fairly subjective. So I'd be hesitant again if a teacher's asking you to do that unless you have really clear guidelines as to what I'm looking for from that. Just because that does become fairly subjective, looks at different skills that one teacher may even rate differently than another language teacher. So just be careful about those kinds of things. Or again, anything that's error analysis, or that you might have a rubric that's kind of subjective and you're thinking, I'm not sure that I understand what the teacher's asking for. I'd be hesitant in scoring some of those. And then another way that you can be helpful in data collection is making modifications to assessments. And I mean that in the realm of making text larger, if you have a student that reads things printed on blue, printing things off on colored paper, breaking it into chunks. So if it's a test that's like 4 pages long, you cut it into 4 sections or something, or just some of those kinds of things. What I don't mean is modifying answers, questions, removing answers. Those are really things that should be done by the teacher. I know that there are times where paraeducators are told, well, just take out 2 answers, don't just do that. I would be hesitant as a paraeducator to do that. I know that you get asked that sometimes, but I really think that's a responsibility of a teacher to make those decisions about which answers to remove, because you are not the teacher of that course. And so I think that that's expecting something of you, because I know that that could come back to maybe from a teacher's perspective, well, why did you take out answer C? You should have left C in and given them A and C. Well, you're not the teacher of that course, and you're not giving that grade. So I would be very hesitant, though, if you were being asked to modify the responses on a test. So just be careful about those things when you're being asked to modify tests. And I know a lot of our teachers respect paraeducators a lot and know that you guys have a lot of good skills, but I just don't want you guys getting in trouble for something, or down the road a teacher being like, well, ugh, she's taking out all the really hard answers to pick from and giving them only the easy ones to pick from. And it's like, well, you asked me to do that task, and I don't want that to ever come back and bite you guys for doing something that maybe isn't in your responsibility. Which leads me to, what shouldn't you be doing when it comes to data collection? Again, that modifying content or answers on assessments is really a teacher's responsibility. Developing assessments, creating those assessments that are being graded for, report cards and for grades and things like that, that's really a teacher's responsibility. Providing students with clues. I know that can be hard when you're giving an assessment. You see a kid thinking and they're really close and they're off maybe by 1 number on a math answer, and you're like, oh, I want to tell them it's 42 and not 41. But you really, really need to be careful that you're just administering that test as the directions state, reading it as it's written, and not giving those clues. Try not to modify scripted instructions. Like the Iowa tests have very specific instructions, and teachers are told very specifically not to modify those instructions. And so you just need to be careful with making sure that you're reading the instructions as they're written. If you're reading instructions differently than they're written, you may miss something that's important, and then halfway through the test, a child's going to ask you a question that should have already been addressed and maybe they've been answering incorrectly the whole time. So just be careful that you're reading things correctly, and that's another reason why getting that test in advance and practicing administering that test is helpful. You guys really shouldn't be asked to administer diagnostic assessments. Like I said, I do a lot of diagnostic assessments, and I took lots of coursework in grad school to administer assessments like that. And it's not that I don't believe that you could, but it's just those are things that are designed to be administered by specific people. Again, like I've said, you really shouldn't be being asked to do error analysis unless you've had some training in that. You know, maybe you've gone to a course on administering reading assessments and you're trained in how to give a BRI. Or if you have had some experience with that, but I would still, say to be more hesitant in some of those kinds of things, especially because your teachers that you're working with should be using that data to define what they're doing with their instruction. You should not be the one asked to analyze data. Your teachers are the ones giving instructions, so if they give an assessment to the class, maybe your job is to put it into a spreadsheet and rank order it, but your teacher should be analyzing what that means and making educational decisions based on that data. Another thing, you are not responsible for setting student goals. Again, especially for students with special needs that are on IEPs, those are always team decisions that the IEP team makes. So if you're being asked to set goals based on data, again, that would be a red flag that that's not within my pay grade. You just be careful of that, especially because those are lots of times educational decisions made by IEP teams. And again, making instructional decisions based on data, that's the role of the teacher. And then assigning student grades really should never be asked of you. You may be asked to record grades in a database or maybe put it into PowerSchool or do some of those things, but again, you should not be being asked to assign that grade to that student. So those are some of the do's and don'ts of data collection. If you guys have questions about that, or if you feel like you've been asked to do something that you're kind of questioning, like, ooh, I don't know if that falls within my role or if that's something I shouldn't be doing, ask me about that. Ask, if you have AEA people in your building, they should know those do's and don'ts of paraeducator roles and things like that. Ask those questions, or if you have a teacher asking you to do something that you feel uncomfortable with, make sure that they know that I think I'm not supposed to do that, because there really are some do's and don'ts for you guys as paraeducators. And again, it's not that we don't think you can do that, it's that should you be doing it legally. So next I'm going to talk about collecting behavior data. I'm going to give you guys some examples here too of different types of charts that we use and different things that we do with collecting data. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen some of these things. If you worked in a school at all in the last 5 years, I'm sure you've seen frequency charts. A lot of check-in, check-out forms are running around. If you guys have students that visit timeout rooms, or we call them think rooms, or take a break room, or whatever the new language is that everybody uses, we might ask you to fill out a log. Some of you may have students that you've worked with that use intensity scales, and I'll show you an example of that as well. But typically with behavior data, we're looking at that, what I call the FLATAD, the frequency, latency, intensity, topography, accuracy, and duration. Most often, the data we're looking at is frequency, at least in my experience. When we're looking at data for a functional behavior assessment, that's the first data piece that I want, is how often is this happening? and where is this happening. So is it happening 5 times a day in math, but never again throughout the day? That tells me a lot of information. Is it happening 5 times a day in every class? That tells me a whole different kind of information. And so that's where I really think that you guys can be very, very valuable in that collection, is what does that look like in helping us to find that frequency of behaviors and things like that. I'm going to show you guys a few examples here of some charts and things. I took picture shots of all of these charts, so some of them might be a little grainy or hard to read. If you do want any of these charts for any reason, you can email me and I'll get them. A lot of these are things that would be charts and graphs created by your teacher or the AEA support staff, or maybe even the Keystone AEA Behavior Resource Team. So they're forms that you would get, typically given to you by your supporting teacher, the teacher you're supporting. But if you do want full copies of them, I can email those out. I think I put my email at the end. If I didn't, I will shoot that into the chat box for you guys. So this is a frequency chart. Usually on a frequency chart, we're collecting data for 10 days. That's kind of the duration of data that we look at to be able to make a determination of why a behavior is happening, so that function of the behavior. Not entirely sure where that 10-day came from. I'm not on the behavior resource team, so I don't need to know that. I just say 10 days because that's what they told me. But this is where we just chart what's that behavior, and we put a dash mark. Typically, those challenging behaviors are listed at the top there as what is the problem behavior? What am I looking for? For some students, we're going to collect a dash mark for any behavior that's atypical. For some students, we're looking at very specific types of behaviors. So for some kids, it might be anytime they do something that's slightly off or different than what we would see. It just depends on kind of what the purpose is of that data collection, and whoever's asking you to collect that data, I would hope has described that enough and given you some indication of what we're looking for. And I know on frequency charts it's hard because you want to give a descriptor of the behavior, but when we're asking to get frequency data, I really care that you just put a dash mark. It happened, and that's it. If you want to take additional notes that are qualitative, that give some descriptions of those things, that's fine. For some of our kids, you could be writing all day long. You could be writing note after note after note if you're trying to get all the details. If you have a behavior that's really excessive, maybe you would note that at the bottom, or say, -2 during literacy was like he punched a kid or something. You might want to note that, but really what we're looking for, especially for our functional behavior assessment, is patterns. We're looking to see if it occurs more often in certain classes, certain settings. So really that dash mark is all I'm looking for. I don't need to know what it was for, what behavior you saw, really just a dash. That anecdotal information can be helpful for some things, like if we need to talk about that topography, what does that behavior look like? But I think that's information we can easily get from you as you've been watching these students. You'll start to see which of those behaviors happen more often. Or if we see that there's some patterns, but we need more information on that, we might say, okay, now we're going to do for 3 more days more specific behaviors, and I want you to put a check for this and a plus or a minus for this to get a little bit more detailed. But typically that dash mark and that 10 days of frequency data really do tell us enough to make a decision about what's the frequency or the function of that behavior. This one that you're looking at right now is a frequency chart for the whole day of a student's day. So down the left-hand side, you'd list all the different activities, morning meeting, literacy, intervention, break, recess, lunch. So it would have that whole day's schedule on there. And that's a good chart for if you maybe follow a student around all day long and you're with that same student all day. Or a student that maybe is in the same classroom most of the day, so like those elementary students that maybe don't switch very much, you would use a full day one for. So, and that same person might be taking that information, or if you switch off and on in that same classroom with another paraprofessional, you would take turns in doing that, or maybe the teacher wants to collect that data during one of those periods or something. That would be for those kids that are kind of stationary in the same place most day. We also do frequency charts that would be for kids that maybe move around the room or move around the building a lot. So if you're working with high school kids, middle school kids, or even elementary kids that maybe switch classrooms a lot, it may be easier to just give each classroom their own frequency chart to fill out, especially for some of those students that maybe go to a class where there isn't a paraeducator. We still need that data. You might not be the one collecting at that period, but we do need to make sure we're getting that accurate data from all class periods. One thing with that one class is that a way that is helpful in just organizing that is that if that then gets transferred back to another full day sheet, just so that it's kind of in one place. So that might be something that you would be asked to do too, is maybe go around to the teachers at the end of the day, pick those up, and transfer those tally marks to a full day sheet. And then what we typically do with that data is we put that into an Excel spreadsheet and look at that for patterns. So, and that could be something that a teacher might ask you to do too, is just to dump that information into a Excel spreadsheet, which is appropriate. I wouldn't expect you to look at that and analyze it. Analyzing frequency data, I don't even feel comfortable sometimes that I've come up with really the right function. I often have to take that to one of my colleagues and say, okay, this is what I'm seeing. I see some patterns, but not a lot. Here's kind of what the behaviors look like. And a lot of times it really becomes that conversation after all that data is collected as to, okay, the function of this is probably escape, because we see it happening in math and reading. And Johnny's not good at math and reading, and he doesn't like to do those tasks. And so then that analysis really becomes that team analysis. And your input, though, as a paraeducator, especially because you've been monitoring those behaviors so closely for 10 days, is really, really helpful in if we're saying, so, okay, it's happening a lot in math. Do you know what was that trigger in math? Was it being asked to do multiplication? Well, okay, we know Johnny really can't do multiplication facts, so of course Johnny's going to maybe throw a fit to try and get out of doing that work. So, so we would never want you to analyze that data by yourself, but being part of that conversation is really helpful and important. So that would be a frequency chart to look at how often something is happening. A lot of our schools, especially our PBIS schools, use check-in, check-out forms as a way to monitor behavior. If you're not familiar with a check-in, check-out system, typically what happens with check-in, check-out is a student will meet with an adult in the morning. That may be a teacher, that may be a paraprofessional, it may be the principal, the guidance counselor. It could be an adult or a high school buddy. It could be just about anybody. But that check-in in the morning is really that positive prep for their day to say, all right, we're going to do great today. Do you have any questions about what's going on for the day? How are you feeling? Did you get a good night's sleep? Did you have breakfast? Really that you're that cheerleader in the morning, making them feel good about themselves and that they're going to be okay during the day. And then typically that's when the student gets their check-in sheet and check-out sheet for the day. And these can be modified to be whatever you feel is necessary for that student. This is just an example of one that we've done with a student. And if the student gets a smiley point, that means great job, and they get 2 points. So a smiley face is 2 points. A straight face means that they need to work on that a little bit. That skill wasn't great today, and they get 1 point for that. And then if they have a sad face, that means that they really need to try again, try better next time, and they'd get no points for that. And then typically students have a goal that they're aiming for by the end of the day, and if they can get the certain amount of points or whatever, we offer a reward at the end of the day when they check out. And they go over that sheet. Again, could be a variety of people that you would check out with. One thing with check-in, check-out sheets is it kind of helps us get at that accuracy piece. We are checking this during multiple points during the day, so it's sort of a little bit about frequency, but it's more about that accuracy. Is the student able to, for example, that second category over says show respect. Am I following directions and using appropriate physical space with others? Am I respecting the boundaries of others? You know, maybe that student got a couple straight faces that day. That shows us that their accuracy with showing respect isn't perfect right now. And that might be something where maybe the teacher needs to do a social skills lesson on how do I talk to people appropriate distance? How do I judge when a person's uncomfortable with me in their personal space? So that would be one of those examples of how this can get at that accuracy piece. And we do have a lot of students in a number of districts that are using check-in, check-out forms, and it's a really good way for everybody to be involved in monitoring student behavior. A lot of times when we have checkout at the end of each class period, the teacher will ask that student, or maybe it's a paraprofessional, or maybe it's a volunteer in the classroom. It could be a variety of people that ask that. So how do you think you did? What do you think? And they might say, well, I think I get a smiley face. And you may disagree with that a little bit because you may have seen that, well, remember you blurted out in class a few times? And that's really something we're working on. So maybe we get a straight face for this. But really having that conversation about what we saw and what's expected. And I think it's just a great way for students to monitor their own behavior too and to be aware of themselves. So I do know a lot of our school districts use these for kids as that that tier 2 kind of interventions for behaviors. So I'm sure a lot of you have been exposed to that check-in, check-out, or have some kind of system where students are monitoring their behavior throughout the day. And if you have other examples that you've used at your school districts, those might be nice things to share out at the end here too. So I know that I think one of the districts I've been in used something called Check and Connect, and so it's a little different in how they use that language, but it's the same kind of a thing where we're helping to monitor that behavior throughout the day to see if I'm being successful at those behaviors I'm being taught. So this particular example has 4 different things: be responsible, show respect, do my best, and help the rest. And you might see at a different school district that they might just have one column because it's the students only working on not blurting out in class. So you may only be collecting data on that one skill. But we use this as a self-regulatory kind of a thing for students, but also so we can get that accuracy data. So that's kind of that check-in, check-out. I know I'm going over a lot of stuff, so if you have questions, do use the chat box. So, but I'm going to give you guys some time here in a little bit to do some table talk as well. So, one of the next things that we do when collecting data that you may have been asked to use, or maybe you've never seen this, it's called a 5-point scale. When we're talking about intensity of behavior, that can be hard to measure or put a number to. Really, the only way to get at intensity tends to be that kind of a Likert scale for any other way to say it, where we're rating that on a scale of 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5. It's kind of like that scale when you go to the doctor's office and they're like, so how bad does it hurt? You know, and you pick that number on the scale. It's really the only way to measure intensity. And intensity can be hard because it is kind of subjective. A 5-point scale, and I know this is hard for you guys maybe to see out there because I had to shrink it a little bit to get this all on here. But when we use 5-point scales, a lot of times we look at the behaviors that we see kids doing, so that topography, what does it look like, and then we give that a number. So a 1 might be normal. I'm doing great, I'm doing fine, everything's good. I just need to enjoy this behavior and it's great. And that's what the kid would be displaying. And so you can kind of say, all right, during literacy, we were at a 1. That's awesome. We want to see them be at a 1. Maybe a 2 looks like they're a little nervous about something, hesitant. One of my students, this is an example from one of my students, he called it my shy mouth. So he said, I look shy when I'm at a number 2. So it's that trying to get a feel of what that looks like. This student also said when he was at a 3, and I thought this was interesting. This is a student that I've worked with on the autism spectrum. And he said at a 3, when I get nervous, I laugh or I cover my ears. So it's those kinds of things that we can look for to say, okay, the level of agitation, the level of stress and anxiety, and kind of give that a number. A number 4 for this particular student was maybe I argue with you, or I have these voices in my head telling me things, or maybe I'm going to say something not so nice to you, you know. It's not to that point where they're going to escalate to beating you up, or, you know, but some of our students would be verbally escalated at this point, yelling, maybe profanity. This could even be like maybe they threw a pencil at you, so they're mad but not enough to pick up a chair and chuck a chair at you. But 5, that's when they're out of control. 5, I have lost control. I'm screaming, I'm crying, I'm harming you, I'm breaking property. Obviously, we don't want kids to get at a 5, but if you do have those kids that escalate on a continuum, this is a really good way to measure how often during the day were they at a 5. You know, did it happen 4 times today? Wow, that's a lot. 4 times today, Johnny picked up a chair and chucked it at me. Well, that's pretty extreme, where, okay, 4 times a day, Johnny looked a little sad or a little nervous, like a number 2. All right, we can work with that. That's not that big of a deal. But 5 times out of 5, that's kind of something where we're going to look at that and go, wow, we need a different plan. We need something else to happen to make sure that this kiddo is okay. And a lot of times we use these scales for kids to tell us how they're feeling too. Especially if you work with students that are maybe cognitively delayed, younger students who maybe can't tell you, I feel nervous, or students with autism spectrum disorders, they really have a hard time articulating what they're feeling. They might be able to say, I'm at a 3, because to them 3 means something, and you're like, okay, I get that, good. And here's what we can do. Let's take a walk. Let's do something to reset. But just saying, well, how are you feeling today? To a 6-year-old, they're going to go, I'm happy. They may not, you know, they may know 3 emotions right now, happy, sad, and angry. So there's a big difference in asking a kid how they feel, or let's take out our 5-point scale. How are you doing right now? Do we need a break? Do we need a reset? And that helps monitor, you know, because some of you may act as a one-on-one, or we don't like to use that term very often, but that direct associate or paraprofessional to a student, and you may be the first person to get hit, kicked, bit, slapped in the face, punched. I mean, you guys are the front line a lot of times with those kiddos. Having a way to monitor that intensity of emotion can be really, really helpful just for you to have a sense of, okay, Jimmy doesn't look okay. how you doing, buddy? Where are you at? And kind of go from there. And I know a lot of my teachers will then take this and they'll break it down into one. Looks like this. This is what the kiddos says he feels like. And then maybe underneath there's a description of what the teacher's going to do, or the adult that's in the, anybody could do as a response to that. So like if we say that Johnny's at a 3, maybe what Johnny knows is we're going to do a reset. But for you, that might be, okay, here's 3 options. Go to the drinking fountain. Go down to the teacher's classroom and get a book and bring it back. Go to my locker and put something away and go back to class. A reset's just that real quick, I'm going to go, come back. But you might have a sheet that looks different than what Johnny has. You know, your student might have this one in front of him that says, okay, I'm at a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You might have something with some more instruction of, okay, we're at a 4. Now here's what I need to do next. And have that plan of what to do. So I love 5-point scales just for the fact that it helps us to monitor intensity of that behavior and where that student's at. Some other things that you might see, this is an example of just another recording like compliance. A lot of times we have kids that are non-compliant, so you might be asked to, what's the data look like for, did they do what they were asked right away? Did they have to go to the think room? Did they have aggressions? There's just a whole lot of ways to monitor behavior data. So this is just another example of something that I made for a student who was super non-compliant, just wouldn't ever do anything. So this was how we monitored whether or not that student was being compliant in the classroom. And if they had to go to the think room, how long were they there, how many minutes they were there. Legally, when we take students to timeout, I'm just going to use timeout because that makes sense, even though you may call it something very different in your school district. I'm trying to think, there's a couple of school districts that have some real clever names for their timeout rooms, and I love that. But legally, if we have students in timeout for an extended period of time, so if a child has to be removed and in a place of seclusion, we really are legally responsible for making sure that they've been offered a break, a bathroom break. Typically at like 45 minutes, we should be offering that student, do you need to use the restroom? Do you need a drink? Are you feeling okay? And making sure that we're monitoring that. Students should never be locked in a room, ever. If a door has a lock, make sure that you have a key. I know that there are some districts that they've done their best to find a space to be a think room or to be a timeout room, or maybe you've even created a space in the corner of your classroom. Just making sure that a student's not ever locked in that space, and that they're given that break, and documenting that is really important. You know, if you've been taking a child or to a think room or a timeout room or whatever regularly, and you have not been asked to document that, it might be good to remind the teacher that's having you do that this really needs to be documented, or mention something to the administration that really you need to be documenting that. And that can be as simple as just a chart that says student name, the date, who brought them to the think room, how long they were there, and if they were there for more than 45 minutes, how often were they offered a break. It doesn't need to be extensive, but it just needs to be somewhere that that's being documented. I know a lot of school districts have forms that they fill out if a student's been in timeout for more than 45 minutes. So maybe they might not ask you to do it for a kid that goes for 5 minutes and leaves. But I do think it's important that that's documented, and that's really good data to have on a kid. If you're taking a kid 3 or 4 times to timeout, even if it's just for 5 minutes, that's still very telling about the child and their needs. So that might be something, too, to be thinking about is, man, I went to the timeout room 5 times today with that same child, and I've not documented that anywhere. That's good data that that teacher should be keeping track of. And, you know, maybe just a tally sheet that says to the date and how many times they went, and maybe a quick jot down of they were in for 10 minutes this time and 5 minutes this time and 22 minutes this time, you know, just those kinds of things. But it is kind of, that is really important data. And again, when it becomes more than that 45 minutes, that's legal data you need to have collected. So if you're involved in any of those situations where you have those students that display behaviors chronically, it might be better to have some kind of way to record that as well. So I'm going to stop talking here for a little bit because I'm boring to listen to the whole time, I think. I don't know how many of you guys downloaded the materials online. If you haven't, out on the website, and I'll give you guys plenty of time if you want to go out and look that information up. It's out under the paraeducator class information and all of that. There's an example, a case example, and I'll pull it up on the screen here as well, and a functional assessment frequency chart. So let me, I'm going to exit out of here real quick. I hope I'm still, all right. Yay, this is working. So there's a behavior case example for Jimmy. I apologize if I'm using a name of one of your children, or someone that is, you know, a friend of yours, or if it happens to be your name, apologize. I'm going to try and make this smaller so you can see it a little bit better. If you go out under, on Keystone's website, and it would be under workshops and, or professional development, excuse me. If you go out under professional development, and then there should be for paraeducators, and if you scroll, yeah, if you click on the classes, and if you scroll all the way, this one, no, if you scroll all the way to the bottom under the classes, you'll see my picture, and there should be some handouts, the PowerPoints there, and then there's a case example as well as a functional assessment frequency chart. The frequency chart, I have filled in a few of the days of the frequency chart, so you'll see that here. I've completed, I'm trying to get this to fit on here. I've completed days 1, 2, and 3, so you'll see that I've done that. What I'd like you guys to do at your attendance centers, or if you're taking it by yourself, you can do it by yourself, but I'd like you guys to take, and I'll give you at least 10 minutes. I'll check in about 10 minutes. But what I'd like you guys to do is go through the case example on Jimmy and put tally marks in day 4 for what you would see with these behavior descriptions of each period, how many tally points you would give. It's kind of, sometimes things are subjective, or you look at those behaviors and you think, is this a behavior, is this not? So talk about that with your group, and I'll show you at the end what I would put for the tallies. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm right, but I'll share that with you. So, so that's kind of the task. You can, somebody asked if we could do it in 5 minutes. Do you mean in 5 minutes over in Decorah? Is that what you're asking me? Or are you asking me if you can chart day 5? Not sure. But I'll give, I'll check back in 5 minutes. If you guys think you're good and you're done, that's fine. If not, if you need more time, then I'll give you a little bit more time. So we do have an example later on too for reading. So take a break now if you need to too, if you need to use the restroom or anything. But I'll check back in about 5 minutes. If you have questions or if you can't get anything downloaded, let me know, and I'll try and put those things back up on the main screen. So, yep, just touch base with me if you need any additional support with getting this done. Okay. Can you guys get it? There's a free one.
Yeah, where is the charter?
Hold on.
That's insane.
It's so hard to be quiet for so long. It's like when I work.
If people could chime in and let me know how you're doing on this. If you need a few more minutes, let me know. If not, we can kind of have a little discussion about all of this. So if you just in the chat box, let me know if you're ready to keep moving. I will keep moving on.
I would
Oh,
say
no, he
one.
stayed in for 5
Yeah.
years, I see.
I would say one at
Yep.
recess time.
He refused to play.
Got out his book, did not turn to the correct page. There's one. Follow along with teacher instructions. A peer opened his book to the right page for him, blurted out the answer 2 times without raising his hand, called another student stupid. There's the name.
Looks like pretty much everybody's getting ready here to move on. I'm going to pull up kind of where I would put some answers. Now, you guys might disagree. There might be some things that you guys see as being a little more, how do I say this, in more of a disruption than maybe I marked it as. But here's kind of where I'm seeing things. Ooh, if I can get this.
Finished packing his bag for him.
All right, so here's kind of where I put this at. And again, you might have put, can I see this? You can do that one. Okay, so here's kind of where I put it at morning meeting. And you'll notice that Jimmy had an exceptionally bad day on day 4. A little bit more intense needs than maybe some of the other times. But I put down that he had 5 disruptions during morning meeting. You know, he wouldn't sit down. He needed those teacher directions. He was humming. That was one of the things that was on there, making strange noises. And he pushed a student. So those are kind of the things we're looking for. Those were those behaviors at the top of that sheet. During literacy, he got up and walked around the room, threw a pencil. He didn't read. He blurted 2 times. So there's another 5 things. During daily 5, now you guys may have put 4. I put 3 because he told the teacher to shut up would definitely be a prompt. He did not write anything in his journal. You know, if he wasn't given that instruction to necessarily do that, you know, I wouldn't count that as wrong if the teacher didn't maybe explicitly tell him, write in your journal, unless that's an expectation that he knows every day he has to do that, then I'd mark that. So that could be a mark or it couldn't be. And then when he laid down on the floor and went to sleep, that's clearly non-compliance. That's not an appropriate activity ever, unless it's rest time. So, so that would be a mark. Recess was really good until he pushed a student. Obviously, he's going to get a mark for that. Literacy intervention, and you'll see as we went through this that there's some pattern to where he's successful, like recess, he likes that. Literacy intervention, he did great when he was on an iPad, very motivating, highly engaging. But then when asked to come to the group, he said no, so that's a direct refusal. Then he was even given 2 more prompts, so you'll see that there were those 2 prompts for not coming as well, and then he was removed to the office. Now, in some cases, marking office on that is appropriate because that helps to understand that there was a break there, that he wasn't, or that student wasn't in class. They were sent to the office and somebody else was dealing with that situation. So that also gets at an intensity. So, we say to just put dash marks, but if there's an office referral that occurs, mark that down. That's really helpful to know. Lunchtime. Again, lunch was doing really well until he was done and nobody else was. So I put 4 things there because he got up before being excused, had to be sent back to the table twice, and then called the lunch monitor a dummy. I know that none of us have ever been called a name by a student, but sometimes that happens. Math intervention, noted as being something that the student enjoys, that Jimmy enjoys. He did well, did a nice job. I put 2 marks, and maybe you would have put 3. He refused and needed that assistance back, so there may have been that if he refused to go back to the classroom and then needed assistance, might have been that he was given a prompt and the assistance back to classroom, might have been 2. I just put it as 1, that he needed assistance, but if there was a prompt given and assistance back, could be 2 of those. Then for recess, this is another place where you may have marked it more than just 1, because if you marked that 5 minutes in was something, I mean, that's more of a consequence as opposed to a behavior, but you might look at that as, yep, that's something that happened, and so, and we're also not always monitoring that hall traveling, so did something occur on the way back from math, and making sure we're documenting all of that. And then out at recess, he went outside, refused to play with his peers, and sat by the door the whole time. That may be you may count that as something because that's a refusal to participate in what's going on, or you may count that as nothing because do we care if Jimmy goes and sits by the door the whole time? Again, that's kind of what are we looking for? Do we care? Is that important to note? During math class, got out his book but didn't turn to the correct page and follow along. Now, for some of our students, we would definitely count that as a check. For other students, like if they maybe have ADHD or if you have maybe a tic disorder or something, maybe getting to the right page in the textbook is not really critical to us. Maybe we don't care that he's on the right page, or maybe Jimmy doesn't attend to directions ever, and so he does require somebody to help with that. But you'll see that in this example, a peer helped him get to that right page, so that didn't really become an issue, so I didn't mark it, but you may would have. Obviously, we're going to mark it that he blurted 2 times, calling another peer stupid. But then, some might mark it if he was given the choice to work alone, but that's okay. He was given that choice, so that's nothing wrong. He just chose to be by himself. Now, if he's choosing that all the time, that might be something that we're going to monitor in a different way because there could be something else going on about, is there something else going on like he's scared of his peers or the student maybe feels bullied or something else is happening that if they're always choosing to be alone, especially like that recess time, if we're choosing to be alone, it's probably nothing wrong because it's your choice to participate or not or to play with your friends. But if he's doing that all the time, then that's something else, that qualitative information where you're writing down some of those little descriptive notes might be helpful. And then during checkout and go home, I put 5 tally marks because he refused to let the teacher check his bag. There were 2 times that he refused to let the teacher. Actually, that should have been 6 things because he had 2 more reminders. And then he called the teacher a name and refused that high five. So really, the end of the day was really pretty rotten. And there is a good question here from Dubuque out in the chat about that 5 minutes of recess time. Would that be counted towards math class? You really could, because it is a result of that math class. Yeah, that's a really good question, because if there is some consequence and it's happening because of a transition or because of something that happened in another class, you could definitely note that, because if you really feel like it's because Jimmy didn't want to leave math intervention and that's why something else happened, it would definitely be because of math intervention or that transition time there. And if that transition is always hard, that might be something to add as another category too, that hallway transition maybe is difficult. You know, if you have that student that every time they go from PE back to the general ed classroom stops and drops in the hallway and throws a fit, that's a whole nother period that you should probably be collecting data. Or if they run, or if they're, you know, they try and go to the office every single time, or they try to go to the nurse's office every time, that might be another area to add to that chart. Dubuque also asked about giving the high five. I did not mark that as a wrong, as the student give a high five. That's just some anecdotal data, but definitely there were 5 or 6 times that he refused to do what the teacher told him. Yeah, that high five, again, is that choice like recess. Am I going to participate in recess? Am I not? You know, now if he had called the teacher a bad name instead of giving the high five, then I'd definitely be a little more concerned about that behavior. So that's kind of that case example. The next thing we're going to do is talk about collecting academic data. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here and get back into the PowerPoint. Collecting academic data is really kind of, there's only a few things that you guys will really do when collecting academic data. As far as administering tests, again, we talked about doing those standardized assessments and reading tests out loud, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But you're going to mostly, if you're helping collect academic data, you're going to be collecting accuracy data, really. Can they read accurately? Are they reading enough words per minute? Are they able to do just a variety of accuracy types of things? And there's all kinds of things for reading, math, writing. I'm just going to show you some examples of things. A lot of you have probably helped administer these next couple of things. And then I'll have you do another case example. You'll get to listen to me read as a poor reader here in a little bit, so don't make fun of me. This is just an example of a reading fluency probe. Like I said, lots of your school districts use DIBELS, especially for those kindergarten, first grade levels, because that might be your annual progress reporting data. You really need to read directions exactly as they're written. I'm going to have you read this passage. You will have 1 minute. I will tell you when to stop. Read as quickly and as accurately as you can. You know, making sure that they understand that the goal is to read quickly, but also accurately. Sometimes we have those kids that read 900 miles an hour and miss every other word because they're not attending to what they're reading. So, and you may have teachers that don't want you to give these assessments, and that's okay. I'm just telling you that I don't think it's inappropriate for you to do that. I think it's appropriate. Some of your teachers may prefer to collect this data because they use it for analysis of what they're reading to. So you may be asked to do this, you may not. You may also be asked to do this if you do the benchmark assessments throughout the year for all grades as one of the administrators for all students. So it may not just be for kids that we're progress monitoring on IEPs, but it might just be those benchmark assessments that you're just doing it to get that fluency record. This is just an example of how you would score a sheet. Anytime that there's an error, you put a line through it. You put a little like parenthesis or something when they're done reading. If a student self-corrects a word within 3 seconds, that's okay on Dibbles. So you can write a self-correct above that or erase your dash mark or whatever. But I mean, it's really pretty simple. They read, and you mark it if it's an error. If they're sounding it out and they're taking time sounding it out, that's fine. If they really take a long time to come to a word, or if they just look at a word for 3 seconds or more, tell them what the word is so they move on. Really, though, scoring reading fluency is pretty simple. You just listen real closely to what they're reading and mark any errors. Anything that doesn't sound right, mark that down. And then to calculate those words, you calculate how many words they attempted to read, how many words they got wrong, subtract words wrong, and that's your correct words. You shouldn't, again, be asked to do any error analysis of this, but if you do hear that they're like reading a word like when and they read where, that might be something if you want to write that above the word. Your teachers might appreciate that to go back to do some error analysis. But again, mostly when we're doing this, this is that general outcome measure like we talked about that just gives us, can they read? Are they a fluent reader? And so really our concern is the correct words per minute. And again, these are all timed for a minute. Most fluency probes are just a 1-minute timed probe. So that would be an example of a fluency probe. And again, I'll give you a few minutes, in a few minutes here, I'll give you an opportunity to listen to a passage and score one if you want to. You don't have to score it, but I'll show you kind of, just so that you kind of can listen to that and go along with what that reading looks like. Another data collection piece that we use for comprehension, and I know sometimes people look at maze passages and it doesn't look like a comprehension activity because it's not asking a question about what the student's reading, but what we're looking at is if a student can read context clues. So they'll read a sentence and a word is missing. They have to pick the correct word that fills in the sentence. So a student who's not reading for meaning, who's just reading to read words, will probably not attend very well to what the content is and will pick the wrong words. A student who's reading and really trying to get meaning out of what they're reading recognizes what words should naturally fit in that sentence. Some of our school districts use ones that they've made their own. So some of our districts have taken passages that are written at like a 7th grade level and made a whole bunch of these. And we've, at the agency, at the AEA a few years ago, normed a bunch of passages. So we have some as well. If you're a school that does Dibbles, the Dibbles Next passages have a days passage. It's the same thing as a maze, but it's called a days for Dibbles. If you're giving the ones that are typically school-made and they're comparing them to like our AEA information, those are like 2 minutes timed typically. You see what they can complete in 2 minutes. If you're using those Dibbles passages, those are 3 minutes. So that's again where it's really important to read those instructions and the directions really closely before you give that to know, am I timing this for 2 minutes or 3 minutes? Because that's an extra minute on a maze passage will make a huge difference compared to, you know, if you're scoring it against the days passages. And so just really make sure that you're reading those directions, reading that instructions to the student, and making sure that the student is aware of what you're asking them to do. So that's just one example of a comprehension thing. Some other comprehension things like the Easy CBM passages have really, really, really long reading passages, and I mean some of them are incredibly long, that you can go through, and there's questions at the end. So that would be an activity that you could help administer as well. Those are typically given online, but you can print them off as well. So that would be something appropriate. Those aren't timed. Students are given an unlimited time to read those and respond to questions. You know, and your teachers may have other reading comprehension tasks, like if you work with middle school and high school students, those Jamestown Reader passages would be things that it would be appropriate for you to monitor a student reading that passage and answering those questions. You know, there's some of those things. Read Naturally is another tool that we use. So you might be asked to sit with a student to help monitor, are they doing their repeated readings? Are they doing it correctly? And then helping them answer those questions at the end. So those would be some other types of reading assessments that you might be asked to help with. That's highly appropriate. There's not a lot of error analysis. So those would be some things that would be appropriate. For math, we do a whole variety of things with math. Math can be tricky to do general outcome measures. So we might use application probes. Like this is an example of an application probe. It doesn't give you all the answers for each thing, but this would be from the EasyCBM website. Has a lot of math probes that look at a variety of different areas of math. So they're really good probes. And you can do them either paper, pencil, you can print them off, or students can do them online, and then it automatically charts and graphs their scores and stuff, which is a great tool. And again, these are untimed. So the EasyCBM things are untimed, and you could be asked to maybe sit by a student to help them monitor their on-task, off-task behaviors. Or if it's an older student, the probes for littler kids have a reading out loud button, so they can click it and it will read it to them. But for older students that maybe need things read aloud, you could be maybe asked to read those to the student as well. But again, these are just multiple choice, so it's really easy to administer them and really easy to score them. This is another example of some math application probes. These would be ones that are from they're purchased probes, and they are timed if you're going to compare them to data, or you can do them for accuracy, percent accurate. At the AEA, we normed these, and so we give them with a 7-minute time limit, which is kind of nice if you have that student that's going to take forever, kind of gets at that speed. But if you also have a student, that doesn't do things quickly, you may not want to give them something with speed because you want to know if they actually get the concepts. So I think there's an element to where being timed can sometimes be really good, and sometimes where it really doesn't give you an accurate reflection. And if you are curious at all about the EasyCBM probes, and like I said, I just took a brief snippet of these, so there's not even like the whole answers to everything on here. You can always go out to easycbm.com, and those probes are out there, and you can even log in as yourself if you want to look at those. But those would be things that your teachers might be asking you to give. Another kind of timed math probe that we do a lot of at school are computation probes, just to see if students have mastered their addition, subtraction, multiplication facts. Timed math probes typically are, depending on which probes you're using, because there's a variety of them out there. Some teachers may just ask you for accuracy, so have you do the whole page and a percent correct. Some teachers want it, how many can they do in a time limit, like a 3-minute time limit. Some of your schools might do, they might just have a whole sheet of facts and they want you to try and do as many in 5 minutes. Or, it just depends on what's being asked of you, but that's another example of how to collect math information. And usually these are scored with like digits correct. So like if you said 7 plus 0 is 7, you'd get 1 point. But like let's say the problem is 9 plus 7, that would be 16. And if you got the 1 and the 6, you'd get 2 points. Or if you put 14, you'd get a point for the 1 but not for the 4. So some of those are things that, again, knowing the directions and how that needs to be scored is really important when administering these, especially if you're being asked to score them. So just having that clear understanding of how you're scoring things, because some teachers just want yes or no if it's correct, or maybe they'll give you a point for the digit correct. So it's that real fine line between getting a score of 15 or a score of 18 based on how you're scoring it too. So really making sure that you're asking that question, am I scoring each digit correct, or am I scoring for correct answer? So I think with math, there's can be some difference, or if a question asks for what are the next 3 numbers, do they get a point for each number that they get correct, or do they get it all wrong if they get 1 wrong? You know, asking those questions about scoring is really important. Another academic thing that you might be asked to do is administer a writing fluency probe. Some schools don't use this. They do writing with real life examples from the classroom and then do rubrics. And again, that can be very subjective. But if you have students that are doing like, if you have any teachers doing power writing is just a quick little intervention that students can do to write frequently and to get a lot of practice with writing. So you might be asked to help with that. And really what they're saying is, think for a minute, write for 3 minutes. That's really all we're doing. There's not really a lot of instruction. It's just think for a minute, write for 3. To get at students writing more, just getting more on a page. So your job would be, here's your sentence starter. I knew it was cold when, and you're going to say, all right, I'm going to start the timer. You have 1 minute to think. When that minute is up, you tell them to write. Again, scoring these can be tricky, so it might not be something that you want to do is score them, but at least administering these is simple. I mean, it's just some pretty basic instructions. You don't provide help for spelling or anything. You don't give any prompts or clues or anything. You just say write. And yeah, so scoring them, though, I wouldn't necessarily say you should be responsible for scoring them, but administering them is totally appropriate. So, so yeah, being the person responsible for scoring would be totally okay. And I know there's lots of other things out there. You could maybe be responsible with writing for giving a student that quiet space to work and maybe being the provider of on-task support during writing. If they're given, you know, I need you to write 4 sentences and I want them to be good, complete sentences, and then the teacher's going to grade that, that's totally appropriate too, to administer that or to sit with a student doing that. But again, those math or those writing rubrics tend to be pretty subjective. So just make sure that you feel comfortable with the task that you're being asked. If you're being asked to analyze writing, I'd be more hesitant of that. Other academic things would, again, be just administering classroom assessments, too, or helping with those things. And I know that you guys have all done that at least once in your life. If not every day, you're helping with those kinds of things. Other things, you know, we have some students that maybe need an adult to sit by them to take an AR test or to do, you know, up at the middle school, high school level, if they're doing that I Have a Plan Iowa test, they might need someone to help them do that with reading those questions. Or there's a whole variety of things that, you know, you guys can be asked to help with academic assessments and things like that. So as long as it's not something that really requires, like if you're ever asked to give an IQ test, run, because you're like, really, people should only be allowed to give that if they've been highly trained. So just, there's some things that I know you guys know when that line has been crossed, but, you know, if that's happening a lot, that's maybe not okay. So I'm going to give you guys an example of a reading passage. And like I said, this is me reading like a kind of a poor reader. And if you weren't able to download the reading, there should be out on the website a spot where there's an audio file, but I'll play the audio on through my computer too, but if you need to listen to it again, you can certainly play it again. And then there's a record sheet for you to record the reading on. So it'll look kind of like that example that I showed in the PowerPoint. Make this a little bit smaller here so you can see this. Okay, so this is the record sheet, and what I want you guys to do is listen to the reading example. and then make some dash marks and kind of try to see if you can get pretty consistent with what those errors would be. And now I want you to remember that there could be some self-correction that's happening. So I'm going to play the passage, and like I said, if you want to play it again, you can go back and do that. I need to turn my speaker on though. Okay. I think. Now, if this doesn't work, we'll try again. But so this is the passage that I want you to listen to, and then go through and mark those things. If you can't get it to play on your computer and you need me to play it again, just let me know in that chat box.
This story is The Crow and the Pitcher. Now read this story to me. Please do your best reading. Ready? Begin. Once there lived a sleek black cow. Cow's shiny feathers glistened in the sunlight, and her yellow eyes sparkled like precious jewels. Cow was so strong that he flew for hundreds of miles without stopping. One day, Cow was flying along when he started to feel. You can stop.
Okay, were you guys able to all kind of hear that and follow along with that passage scoring sheet? I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to kind of just talk in your group and look at that a little bit and kind of, because there was a couple times where it might have been tricky to know, do I count that as an error or was that maybe a self-correct? Just kind of take a few minutes and like I said, just a couple, chat about that at your tables, talk about maybe some of the things if you've ever administered a reading fluency passage that maybe you've run into, and just kind of talk about that, like I said, just a couple minutes. And if you want to listen to the passage again, I'll play it again either through my computer or you can play it on your own computers. So.
She started right. Stopped at feet. Oh. I missed the area. She stopped at feet. She got the other.
Sometimes I feel like when they're saying a word and they're trying to correct themselves, then you just don't know that time frame there.
Yes.
It's hard for me
Yes.
to know.
That's hard. Is that 3 seconds or is it?
Yep.
Mhm.
Right.
Definitely.
And did she say he or she there?
She corrected herself.
Yeah, that was a
Oh,
self-correct.
that was a self-correct.
And that's the other self-correct was right at the very beginning.
With lived.
Yep.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
I got 9.
We got 9.
And one's two
And
self-correct.
2 self-corrects.
Two self-corrects.
What did I miss?
Did you miss one at the very end? I don't think so.
Sure. 36 or 38 correct ones. Is that right?
Yeah, see, I didn't, yes, 38.
Do any of you guys want more time to kind of think about that or look at this or to kind of analyze what
She stopped.
those errors look like?
So there's 49 words there. You take away 2. No, there's 49 words if you read to the end of this passage.
Does anybody want to share what they got for their total correct words? Did anybody calculate that out?
38 correct.
Okay, what was on?
You're gonna play it again, you said?
I can play it again if you want to listen to it again.
Yeah.
I'll play it one more time so that everybody can, if you missed anything.
This story is The Crow and the Pitcher. Now read this story to me. Please do your best reading. Ready? Begin. Once there lived a sleek black cow. Cow's shiny feathers glistened in the sunlight, and her yellow eyes sparkled like precious jewels. Cow was so strong that he flew for hundreds of miles without stopping. One day, Cow was flying along when he started to feel. You can stop.
So you guys will see that on that passage, there were some things that were really pretty obvious, and a lot of you guys were totally dead on here that you've responded. Yeah, read a total of 47 words, got 38 correct. And some of those things are little things you got to listen to, like his and her. Like there's a spot where instead of saying his, said her. Sparkled said speckled. And, you know, like little things like that that you really have to kind of pay attention to, and some of those little differences that you might miss. And then just those self-corrections. So that's just an example of how to do those reading fluency things. I read like a really, really poor reader, but hopefully you won't have that many readers that are like that, but wanted to give you a true example of what you might be seeing. So those are kind of some examples of academic things that you might be seeing and doing. Some other things, like I said, you might be asked to record and chart data. Using like record sheets and stuff, your teachers might have Excel programs that they ask you to put things in. If you've ever used the Web IEP programming, there's some things that you should never be the one responsible for filling out. They may ask you to go in and put the scores in on that left-hand side, like the date and the score. But you really should never be the one putting in if there's a baseline. You could maybe put in a comment if the child was not feeling well or something weird happened, like, oh, halfway through doing this rubric there was a fire drill, you know, maybe documenting those kinds of things. But you should never, ever, ever be asked to do that phase line information, because that's really a decision that's should be made by the teacher. So on the Web IEP, there's worksheets that you can print off to record things, so teachers might ask you to do that. There's also the online recording, where, again, putting in the data is fine. Making those comments, though, would be not appropriate. So, so that's just one way that, you know, you could be given access to that. And then kind of to end here, just some tips about reading tests to kids, and then I'll give you some other accommodations that maybe you would be asked to do. When reading tests to students, and I said this earlier, but that consistent tone of voice is really important. You want to read at a rate of about 120 to 160 words per minute. And I know that sounds really weird to think I need to read at a certain rate, but like when we have books on tape, they're typically read between 120 and 160 words per minute. So if you need to practice yourself, take a selection that's like 140 words long and try to read it in a minute. I read really fast, and so I have a really hard time maintaining that 120 to 160 words per minute when I'm reading to kids. Try to pause 2 to 3 seconds between each answer. That also eliminates you from like reading quickly through answers that are wrong and giving lots of emphasis to correct answers. So that's a good tip. I tell this to lots of people. Only read questions again if a student asks you to, unless you're working with a student that will never ask you to. If you see that they're really stuck, read it again. Sometimes by rereading a question, you may give the student the impression that they're wrong and they need to rethink their answer. So really be careful with that. That could be you giving them that extra clue that you're wrong, or they may have the right answer and they may second guess themselves because of you reading the question again. So a lot of times I'll tell people, tell kids I'm only going to read it once unless you raise your hand and ask for it again. Try not to inflect your voice on correct answers, and I always encourage practicing before reading a test out loud. I mean, I think that helps me too. I always like to look at an assessment or something before I give it to make sure I've read the directions through, to make sure I'm on target with administering that test. But these are just some little tips that I've found to be helpful over time as I've administered assessments. Some other accommodations that you might be asked to give. Larger text. You may be asked to enlarge the text on something, print on colored paper, cutting things into chunks, obviously reading tests out loud. You may be asked to give those breaks to students. So maybe if you've worked on a test and they worked for 20 minutes and they all look glassy-eyed and like they're going to like kill their neighbor, let's take a break and go to get a drink and come back. You may just be there sitting there to remind them, oh, Johnny, you got to stay on task. You got to answer this question. Oh, don't just click. Let's really read the question. You know, those are okay kind of prompts to give. And you may also be asked to fill in bubble sheets for students, which is okay as long as obviously you're filling in exactly what the student says the answer is. So don't want you guys to be any of those schools to get in trouble for not answering what students say. I had some more table talk things, but if you guys want to use these might be things that you could use as you're writing your paper, if any of you need to write your papers, or things to just be thinking about. But what are some of the ways maybe you have collected data? Are there things you've ever been confused with or struggled with that you've been asked to do? Or are there other tips that you might have for your colleagues sitting in the same room with you about, well, here's what I do when I have to give this thing or when I'm asked to do this. So I know all of you guys want to keep moving, so I won't have you do the table talk, but these might be some things to consider as you're thinking through your paper, or things to just be thinking about that if you have other tips, might be something to share. So I know we went through kind of a lot of stuff. I hope this was at least helpful in some way. It's what they asked me to talk about, so I feel like it's sometimes not the most exciting topic, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to use that chat box. I will definitely stay on here until 6 o'clock. I do have to read this other piece of paper that says, each participant taking this course for recertification credit will need to write and submit a one-page paper. The paper will be scored pass-fail using the scoring rubric found on the website under the recertification column. It is called Para Recertification Course Assignment Rubric. Please refer to this when writing your paper. This paper should be submitted to Sean Curo, Delhi Field Office, Van Route 7, no later than April 24th, 2013. You may send your paper in an envelope on the Keystone van and send that again to Sean Curo, Delhi Field Office, Route 7, or you can send it electronically to Sean. I'm sure all of you have this information because this would not be the first time you've had this, but her email is scurroe@aea1.k12.ia.us. Participants not taking this course for credit do not need to write a reflection paper. So that's my directions to you about your paper. Again, if you have questions, send those to Sean. And if you have questions for me, like I said, I'm going to stick around here for a little bit. So if you have thoughts or questions or anything you want to share, feel free to use that chat. Thank you guys all for participating tonight and not making fun of my poor reading.
Thank you.